What is it about the casual players and the professional players in Apex Legends that never seem to see eye to eye on things? Pros will argue that what they want changed is for the greater good, and casuals will usually disagree and tell them that they're ruining all the fun. In this video, we're discussing the disconnect between the large majority of the player base and the Apex pro player scene. For some time now, there's been numerous differing opinions between the casual player base and the pros when it comes to the overall state of the game. What legends need a nerf or a buff, what weapons need to be toned down, and even more minor things like the self-res knockdown or the map rotations. Your run-of-the-mill casual player who only puts in a handful of hours a week on the game is simply not going to have or understand the same opinions as a pro player would. Those pros are usually playing the game for a living and playing anywhere from 40 to 80 hours a week while trying to learn the game inside and out. So whether it's in Twitch chats, on Twitter, or in a turbulent subreddit, this growing rift between the pros and the casuals is very real, and we're going to break down why. I've come to learn some really eye-opening things about this topic that not too many people seem to know. This is an Apex Legends masterclass, so let's get into it. Now, for clarification purposes, a pro is not necessarily always going to be someone who's signed to an esports org or competing in the ALGS. I mean, it could just be someone who plays the game for a living as a successful creator, or even an extremely sweaty player who plays on a professional level. This is not to say that every player who is not on a professional level automatically hates or doesn't see eye to eye with the pros, because there's plenty of non-pro players out there who play Apex often and can also have a deeper understanding of what helps and hurts the state of the game. However, an overwhelming majority of casual players seem to often despise pro players for their seemingly strong influence on changes made in the game. They usually just don't agree with their opinions or insight. And if you were to ask pros, they would say they want changes that will bring a more overall balance to the game that they usually play on a full-time basis. Whereas the casual player is usually more focused on what's going to make the game more fun and is not focused on breaching a skill gap so that they can stand up to the sweatiest of players. But with that said, let's dive deeper into some major reasons behind this disconnect. First off, casuals have different expectations of what needs to be buffed and nerfed. Pros typically want to see changes to things that they see as unbalanced or things that just don't blend well into the current state of Apex. Pros are experiencing this in a much more extensive manner when it comes down to it. I mean, they literally just play the game the most, more than even people who created the game. As that experience grows in a live service game like Apex, well, they start to see this thing called power creep from certain legends, game mechanics, or even weapons. Casuals see this from a different point of view, and this is much more two-pronged. One is they simply just don't see the same level of play that the pro is experiencing, and therefore don't really see how something could be so overpowered. I mean, due to the sheer competition they experience, it's just not matching up. See, if you're part of the top, let's say 5% of the player base and are constantly playing against that top percentage in your games, well, this means that the things that you are seeing are going to be amplified. So when one legend or weapon is only slightly annoying to the casual because, well, they rarely see it, and when they do, it's not in the hands of a great player, then of course they don't see the urge to have it changed. But if you're an Apex Predator in a lobby filled with 59 other Apex Predators, well, that overpowered Spitfire meta becomes even more annoying and difficult to combat. This example can be interchanged with anything that has ever been too overpowered in Apex that the pros have asked for a nerf on and the casuals have generally disagreed with. Now, on top of this, the casuals aren't coming close to the amount of playtime that pros have accumulated, but I'm gonna hit this from a different light. This isn't a negative thing by any means, but at the end of the day, Apex has so many variables, big and small, and as a result, if a pro plays this game for 8 hours a day and the casual plays it for 1 hour, they will both see that power creep vastly different, because one may not even experience it in their 1 hour of game time. Meanwhile, the pro has seen it probably 10 times that amount in their 8-hour session. Secondly, there is a feeling that pros are continuously trying to ruin the overall experience of the game because of what and how often they call for nerfs. The more imbalanced pros experience in Apex, the more they tend to speak up on platforms like Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, and Reddit. Engagement drives more engagement. That's how most algorithms are structured. But this is a video on the pros and the casuals, so what does the Twitter algorithm have to do with anything? Well, let's just say if a pro calls for something to be nerfed, but it's not something the average casual player really ever experiences, it tends to drive outrage, ultimately equating to comments, downvotes, dislikes, etc. And this propels the post to even more interactions. Platforms like Facebook and many others have been heavily criticized due to the fact that their feed doesn't distinguish between you liking or hating something on the feed. All that matters is the time you're spending interacting with it. So just from a sheer human psychology standpoint, posts that have a hot take around game balancing tend to stoke the fire more. You won't think twice about a positive post you agree with, but most are far more likely to spend more time arguing about how pros want everything nerfed. And this helps feed the cycle. Interestingly enough, both sides don't seem to conflict too much around what needs to be buffed and what doesn't. It's usually around a nerf or a potential game-changing mechanic. Now, essentially on the same side of things, there are also things that the casual player base wants nerfed simply due to it being inaccessible because of the skill gap, whereas the pro players might not feel the same thing as unbalanced, but simply a game skill that can be learned. An example of this might be everyone's favorite hot topic recently, tab strafing. Tab strafing is a very unique movement mechanic that was discovered by a lot of pros and high-level players on PC, frequently used to severely outplay and outmaneuver their opponents. This type of movement mechanic is something far trickier to do than something like, say, a slide jump that just about every player can do on either input. The mechanic raised the bar of the skill gap, meaning your average player is not always going to be able to do it well or even do it at all. And because of its outplayability, yet inaccessibility, many casual players see it as a huge advantage high-level players have over them and want to see it removed. Pros, on the other hand, absolutely want it to stay. One thing that we can all agree on is that one of the most unique and special things about Apex Legends is the incredible fast-paced movement abilities it has. Most high-level or pro players view taking something like this out of the game as removing part of the core of what the game is. On top of all of this, some movement mechanics like tap strafing are mostly inaccessible to console players and controller players in general, and a massive part of the players and predominantly the more casual player base is on console. This means that an enormous amount of players are simply not able to even perform a mechanic like this, which pretty obviously leads to why they would want it removed from the game. Now, we could get into the details surrounding crossplay and how most casuals on console simply would just never run into an opponent tap strafing, but that's not really my point here. See, tap strafing wasn't something Apex put in the game deliberately, but rather a combination of movement mechanics executed by high-level mouse and keyboard players to outplay opponents. And when the more casual player on controller on console sees that, they could feel angry that it's not something they themselves are able to learn and do. But this leads me to the biggest issue that I see from my perspective, and seriously, it deserves your attention. Apex relies on a large player base, and as a result, the pro population is a far greater minority than that of the casual population, and this is where the disconnect stems from. Those on a pro level often feel slighted by the game developers, feeling as though they're catering more towards the casual player and not focusing on making their game fair, balanced, and competitive. Whereas casuals tend to feel slighted by the pros for constantly calling for nerfs and changes they feel puts the skill gap too far out of reach or simply doesn't make the game as fun. This triangular relationship between all parties makes for an extremely delicate balance that the devs end up trying to walk, which is frankly an impossible task. When pros call for a nerf to a specific legend, casual players often just insist that the devs simply buff the related legends in that same class. This is honestly a huge oversight into what the real issue is and why pros are calling for a nerf in the first place. Here's why. In a simple example, if the devs were looking to nerf Valkyrie, plenty of casuals would just rather see that other movement legends like Octane, Pathfinder, and others get a buff instead so that they could bring those other legends up to par with Valkyrie. This, however, overlooks two specific game-breaking decisions here. And one is that the sheer workload on the devs to balance even one legend could actually be an exorbitant amount of work. And the second is that it overlooks how Apex was originally designed, to only have abilities play a small percentage in the overall engagements. Despite how some people may feel these days, Apex is not intended to be an ability-focused game like Overwatch. All Legends abilities are important and useful in their own ways, yes, but Apex is first and foremost a game about movement and gun skill. And when you look back to its predecessor, Titanfall, you see this even more prevalently. Maintaining this desired balance can become an increasingly difficult task with every new legend that is added. You have new abilities, new cooldown times, new ability combos with other legends to consider, and many other things. This is constantly in flux, and the devs must monitor and evaluate what is best for the longevity of the game, as well as maintaining the very core of what they intended the game to be in the first place. And probably the most overlooked aspect in all of this is Legends abilities are not a one-to-one equation. I mean, look, they just buffed Crypto and Watson recently, and they still are in the bottom of the barrel when it comes to pick rates. So fundamentally, certain legends just won't get the same love others will. Flying in the air with a jetpack is frankly always going to beat out placing electrical fences. Live service games like Apex require an ongoing assessment of balancing. John Larson is the balancing dev at Respawn, and his literal job is to monitor the current state of balance in Apex Legends, such as what is too strong and what is too weak. So as a result, the outcome is always going to be a mixture of buffs and nerfs. It's the very nature of a live service game, particularly the delicate balance that Apex tries to maintain. A BR shooter with Legends abilities that tries not to creep too much into the gunplay, but at the same time having a lengthy time to kill and a fairly lengthy time to heal. The average Apex casual player is becoming numb to these calls to nerf certain legends and weapons, but it's almost as if they fail to realize that this will always be an aspect of any live service game. Apex Legends should not be confused with an annual Call of Duty that drops and hardly gets touched again. Apex Legends is an ever-changing live service shooter with literally a 10-year plan. And if we want to see that game that we all know and love continue to thrive and be successful, constant balance changes need to be made. So whether you play Apex 8 hours a day or 8 hours a week, there's got to be some level of understanding from both sides as to what helps this game keep going and keep being so fun to play. If you're interested in how Apex Legends matchmaking works, I suggest you click on this video here. Peace.